Florida. That is a reminder that extreme weather is here in our world, and that is a reminder that we ought to prepare. And that's really what we are here to do, sisters and brothers. We are helping prepare communities in an equitable, sustainable way to become climate resilient. We're just so happy to have some esteemed panelists with us today. So I'm not going to be before you long, but we're just so excited, and we are just elephant glad to have so many wonderful panelists, and also online, and then to our online audience, thank you. Use virtually or use literally or anywhere in the world, but you've decided to be with us. So we're so glad about it. And this is our final event of Climate Prep Week 2022. And we're just, again, so glad. We're glad to have Hero here, and we're glad to, we're just so glad. So I'm gonna step out of the way now, and we're gonna ask our dear brother to come and to do a land acknowledgement, if I'm right. Yes. So we're gonna have our dear brother come up and do a land acknowledgement, and then we are calling after that. Jenny, are we calling you back up after? Or the panelists? All right, then we'll have the panelists after that, and then we're here for a riveting conversation. So yes, dear brother, please come on up, and we welcome you to the microphone.
OCO, Daishu, Shadana Lai E, Ayajagola Waya Sonoy. My people taught us that whenever you talk to people, first of all, let them know who you are and who you represent. I'm Cherokee on my mother's side from South Carolina. I'm Taino Arawak on my grandmother's side, my father's side, from Old San Juan, Puerto Rico. I am also Western Shoshone, my grandfather on my father's side, from out in Utah. Before we get started, I would first like to acknowledge the original peoples of this land that we walk upon, that we call Turtle Island. The Mohawks, the people from the Wampanoag Nation, the Pequots. These were the people that were here before anybody else came here. So thank you all for being here today. The land recognition is always first and foremost with my people. Before the white man came here, there were over 1,200 tribes, civilized tribes. We had our own form of government, and your United States Constitution was stolen from the Six Nations people, the ones that lived in New York, the Mohawks, the Onondaga, and so many other people. Let me let you know this. The US Constitution was not written for anybody with color on their skin. The Constitution was written for the white gentry. Women were not included in that, Black people were not included in that, Native people were not included in that, and nobody else other than the white gentry. So I had to clear that up for you. And when I say they stole it from the Iroquois Confederacy, it's because we had already established the Great Law of Peace. You want to Google something? Google the Great Law of Peace, and then copy it, paste it, and line the US Constitution right up beside it. And you will find that everything that's in that US Constitution, they stole it from our people. They didn't include Black people. They didn't include anything other than what they wanted. They were white-owning, wealthy white men that wrote that Constitution only for their own benefit. Okay, that's my 5-minute lesson. So you want to talk the truth, you want to know the truth. Let's start from the basics, the truth. I have been a 25-year radio broadcaster out of Washington, D.C. I'm the only Native American that ever broadcasts out of Washington, D.C. I also am a broadcaster, a television broadcaster, which is now on YouTube, Amazon Prime, and 7 other media outlets. Just go to YouTube and type in Jay Winter Night Wolf Live, and you can see the truth. If I can't tell the truth, I will never open my mouth. I'll tell you this in my language, Danada, Doai, Wando. Until we meet again, until we talk again. I love you all of you.
I think we'll have the panelists come now for a discussion. And then we have a panelist.
Yeah.
We have a panelist on, maybe we should introduce the panelists. Yeah, you want to introduce? Yeah, this is for y'all. Yes, maybe we should, we'll just have the panelists introduce yourselves, because nobody can introduce you like you can yourself. All right. I didn't get a chance to read everybody's bio before coming here, so I don't.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Jim Recht. I'm a psychiatrist, and my focus is on community psychiatry. I work mainly with individuals who struggle with severe mental illness, substance use problems, and homelessness. Most of my work is in the Boston area, and the case I'm going to talk about tonight has to do with a young woman from the Boston area. But we know that in Somerville, most of the same environmental and social issues exist. That, for example, especially people living close to heavy traffic, people living close to the interstate freeways, I-93, and even Mass Avenue, are going to become more vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat and rising sea levels. I want to hand it over to my colleague, Amrita Sarma, who I'm just overjoyed to be able to sit with tonight.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Amrita Sarma. I'm really excited to be here with you this evening. I am an assistant professor at Boston University in the School of Public Health, and I sit in the Department of Environmental Health. And my research for the last 15, maybe almost 20 years has focused on the health impacts of climate change. And it's really wonderful to see communities that are recognizing the real threat that present day climate change poses, especially to people who are particularly vulnerable, people with underlying health conditions, people who live in communities that have been systematically disadvantaged, both economically and socially across this country, who are now facing the compounding impacts of climate change as well. And the study that I'm going to be sharing today is one that I and my collaborators have done using health insurance data to understand the impacts of extreme heat on the emergency department visits for mental health crises across the country. And I think there are very real lessons that we can learn from this kind of research that can help improve conditions, especially mental health conditions in those members of the communities that are most vulnerable to climate. And so I'll give an opportunity for Dr. Pinsky also to introduce herself. She's over on the Zoom.
Hi, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Pinsky. I'm sorry not to be there. I'm not muted, though.
Can you hear us on the Zoom in there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe there's a issue with the connection to the in-person speakers.
Oh, there you go.
I can hear her.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we have the audio on the Zoom.
Okay, great.
We're good.
All right, go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, so you can hear me in the room now? Yes, okay, terrific. So hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Pinsky. I'm super bummed not to be there with you in person. I live in Somerville and I'm perhaps 250 feet from you, but I'm kept away from you by COVID tonight. I am a pediatrician and a child psychiatrist at Mass General. I work sort of as my day job with children who are medically ill and kids who sort of live at the intersection of medical health and mental health and sort of need some of both. I have come to believe strongly that climate change represents kind of the ultimate intersection of medical and mental health for children. And it has become sort of my primary interest. I will be trying to offer the youth perspective to some of the things that Jim and Amruta talk about tonight. And I cannot see the audience, which I guess is necessary because otherwise the other people on Zoom won't see the presenters, correct? Right, okay.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm going to tell a story about a patient of mine. It's just one example of many, but I hope it will clarify two things. First, that the climate crisis is not a natural disaster. It is caused by social determinants like racial discrimination, redlining, poverty, environmental toxins, lack of access to clean air and water. And second, the climate crisis is causing real harm, direct harm, including in the form of mental illness. At the same time, I want to emphasize that while the patients that I work with primarily are poor and of color, many struggling with housing instability, still, while these communities suffer disproportionately, the climate crisis is harming everyone. It's causing mental health and related health problems in all of our communities, regardless of wealth or privilege. Yes. My story is about a woman I'll call Alana, a young woman in her 20s with schizophrenia, diabetes, and asthma. She lives in her one-bedroom subsidized apartment in Mattapan. And on the day that I visited her as a sort of a house call, she invited me in. We talked in her small living room. I could see that on the day I visited her, which was on the third day of one of many heat waves. This was about 2 summers ago in Boston. I could see that she was more fatigued, seemed more distracted and more disheveled than usual. And she tells me that she has slept poorly for the past several nights since the heat wave began. And the temperature in her apartment seems to be somewhere in the high 80s or maybe 90 degrees. The air quality is very poor and there's very little air circulation. She does have a window air conditioner in her bedroom, but she stopped using it a few weeks ago after receiving a threatening looking bill from the electric utility in a bright orange envelope labeled urgent. So she's not just sleeping poorly, she's frightened of, among other things, getting evicted for non-payment of utilities. Her budget barely covers the monthly rent, even in normal weather. And last month she was unable to pay the full balance on her utility bill because she did use the air conditioning that much more often last month. At first, I considered urging her to come out with me to get some fresh air, but I quickly recall that in this weather, and again, this was in the low 90s on this day, she suffered asthma exacerbations in the past after going outdoors. Her apartment is in one of the many large portions of Mattapan that qualify as heat islands. These are neighborhoods with highly concentrated buildings. Most surfaces are of concrete with very few or no trees on most blocks, very little green cover at all. And so on very hot days, ground level ozone levels along these unshaded sidewalks and skyrocket, causing asthma exacerbations and other forms of severe respiratory illness. And in fact, the next day, I learned from my clinical team that Alana presented to the emergency room during the previous night with an exacerbation of chronic asthma, coughing, wheezing, and short of breath. Her respiratory symptoms eventually improved with a nebulizer treatment, but at this point she was in extreme psychological distress after many days of sleep disturbance and mounting anxiety. She became more paranoid, her hallucinations had become worse, and over the next few days, she became so agitated and reclusive that she needed to be psychiatrically hospitalized. So I'm telling this story as an example, one of many, of how the climate crisis really is a medical emergency, in this case, a psychiatric emergency. And as we talked about, we know that climate change, the cause of this, is in turn caused by choices that we've made, including our dependence on fossil fuels and extractive energies.
Thank you for sharing that experience and that story. So the approach that I take in my day-to-day work is kind of understanding climate change as a risk multiplier or a threat multiplier. And what we mean by that is being exposed to climate change and all of the different extremes that come with it is one issue in and of itself. But if you have climate exposures on top of other underlying conditions, then it just increases and increases and increases and becomes a cycle of distress and medical need. And the story or the study that I wanted to share with you is one that my colleagues and I were able to do in a data set that we have of insurance claims across the entire US. And the reason why I think that the lessons from these types of studies are really beneficial is because it allows us to understand the things that are happening both locally as well as on a larger scale across the country. So it's these examples of emergency room visits from individual patients, but what we're seeing countrywide. And what we found in our study, we looked at all adults over age 18 during the summer times from 2010 to 2019. And we found that as temperatures rose, not even considering extreme heat, just looking at temperature itself, as the temperature got warmer, the rate of people presenting to the emergency departments across the country for mental health crises increased. Very direct. As temperature goes up, more people are visiting ED. The other thing we were able to do in this data, because we have all of this information on insurance claims, is that we were able to look at specific causes of mental illness and how emergency departments increasing with increasing temperatures. And we found that this increasing trend of rates of visits to the emergency room were consistent for substance use disorders, for schizophrenia, for self-harm, for mood disorders, for anxiety and stress disorders, for all of these different mechanisms of mental health that don't seem to be very much related to each other if you ask for a clinical perspective. So why is that the case? What we think is that it's because heat is so stressful for people who are experiencing it at times of extreme, that it exacerbates whatever existing condition one may have. And that's why we see it so consistently across all of these different types of ill health. The other thing that I want to mention is that similar to how we were able to look at different outcomes and different mental illnesses that are associated with temperatures, we were able to look for who are the most vulnerable people in this data. And sorry? Easy. Yeah. So it turns out with commercial health insurance data, there are some difficulties with that, but we did find that one of the things that I think is really interesting and relevant for our audience today is that actually people living in the northern parts of the US went to the emergency room at higher rates than people living in the South. And we think that this might actually be because people living in the South have more air conditioning that they can use. If you look at homes in Boston, they spend more time outside. So they are already experiencing higher temperatures in the southern US, but maybe they're also more used to those higher temperatures and they've done more to prepare their communities for extreme heat. So places like Boston and Seattle, which experienced a huge heat wave, Pacific Northwest heat wave last year, these are the places that are going to really suffer as the climate continues to warm and they don't have things like air conditioning that's prevalent in communities. And so those are a couple of the lessons that we learned that I just wanted to highlight. And I just have to say, I'm really thrilled to be sharing this information with everyone here. One of the things that I always worry about as an academic is, am I kind of shouting out into the void? Who is listening? And I'm really excited to be here sharing this work with people who I hope can benefit from some of this information. So thank you. And I think Elizabeth also was going to say a few words as well.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, we can hear you. No, I was
You guys
just
hear
saying
me?
we can hear you.
Got it. Okay. So I'm just going to add a little bit of the perspective of someone who works with children to that. Thank you guys both so much for sharing that. You know, both Jim and Amrita talked mostly about the mental health impacts of extreme heat, severe heat, and certainly, like almost all of the health impacts of climate change, children and youth are in one way or another more vulnerable than adults are. So kids are more vulnerable to heat stress than grown-ups are, particularly little kids, just because they don't regulate their temperatures as well. They have more body surface for how big they are. They need more water. They take more breaths per minute. They're just sort of physically more vulnerable. But there's also sort of some unique things about kids, including that they spend a lot of their time in school. And we know that extreme heat impacts kids' ability to learn and to function in school. Just right here in Somerville, we had multiple schools whose cooling systems have failed over the last few months. And as we think about these increasingly, hot days, longer into the fall and earlier in the spring, we have to think about our infrastructure and sort of how we're supporting our kids in the learning they need to do. But of course, heat isn't the only aspect of climate change that has mental health outcomes. We think a lot about severe weather events and how those increase rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression in grown-ups and in kids. But there's actually evidence that for children, those impacts are either more severe or last longer a lot of the time. So they're sort of more vulnerable to experiencing those traumas when they're little. Those impacts actually, even for kids, start before they're born. So both heat and air pollution impact development of kids when they're still in utero and can both cause premature birth, which can have sort of brain outcomes. And actually, Amrita had pointed out to me a paper just came out showing that mothers who experience natural disasters when their kids are in utero, those kids then have higher rates of mental illness as young kids. So we know that kids are experiencing these outcomes, that in many ways they're experiencing them more severely than adults. I do think we also have to acknowledge that, leaving aside what we think of as sort of mental illness or disease, young people also experience distress about climate change at much higher rates than adults do. They worry about it more, they fear more fear and grief and anger than older people do. And for a long time, we knew about that in sort of the places of the world that have caused the most emissions and are the most insulated from the impacts of climate change, right? The US, the UK, Australia. But just over the last year, we actually have data from other parts of the world, from Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, that youth in those parts of the world that really are more than some parts of the US at least, experiencing the direct impacts of climate change in ways that are really life-changing. Those kids are really angry and worried as well. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about that data is that one of the things that tracks most closely with the amount of distress that young people have, and to be clear, I'm talking about distress. It is not a mental illness to be distressed about climate change, to be totally clear. is that one of the things that tracks most closely with kids being very distressed is a sense of betrayal by governments and by adults. And I point that out only because to some extent, I find that motivating in terms of the fact that not only as someone who is somewhat older, is it my responsibility to be taking action on climate change, but also that just in the act of trying, it is possible that we are helping with the distress of folks who are younger than us. And I think that is what I have to say. And I think we're now going to Q&A. Is that right, Jim and Amrita?
Yeah, I think so.
Wonderful. I think the three of us wanted to set aside time for question and answer. So we're very happy to address any questions. Please feel free. Any comments? Anyone want to stamp their feet a little bit? Sometimes I want to.
I'm an immigrant, and you just confirmed something that my sisters and I had anecdotally come up with many years ago. So I'm in my late 50s, and one of the things that we wondered. I'm sorry. One of the things that I wondered as an immigrant coming here from Jamaica early, my sisters and brothers and I, we found it odd that in the summertime, Americans would seem to go crazy. This is what we described it as. And we had no explanation, yeah? And when we saw the most violence in our neighborhood, I grew up in Dorchester, and just bizarre behaviors. And so again, this was just from even back in the 70s. So thank you for putting a name to that. And also, my name is Judith Foster, everyone. I run a nonprofit called the Hero Nurturing Center. Hero stands for Healing, Empathy, Redemption, Oasis. And none of the aforementioned things can happen without the proper environment, which I call the oasis. And so I've been preaching for a while that nature heals. So thank you for affirming this. And I'd love to talk with you guys off top. Thank you.
Definitely.
Absolutely. I would just say really briefly, it's not just people in this country who go crazy in the heat. There's a fair amount of research in global health that shows correlations. I think you would know more about this, but I've seen, a fair body of research that shows a direct relationship between increasing average temperatures and conflict. And that includes not just military conflict that's exacerbated by climate change and crop degradation, droughts, those types of things that result in migration and political
It's
conflict.
just a little bit different here than in the islands, because again,
Yes.
people are outdoors and we have beaches, we have the rivers. and
Oh, we're
streams.
crazier here. Yes.
I just, yeah.
Oh, totally. We're number one. USA is number one when it comes to insanity of most kinds, including probably violence. But I just need to point out that
It's everywhere.
it's everywhere. It includes interpersonal conflict, domestic violence goes up during periods of extreme heat as well.
Violent crime too.
Yes,
There's
I
a-
understand.
Yeah, there's a recent study from the USDA, from some colleagues looking at increasing temperature and gun violence. And they were able to show correlations across the country as well.
So sadly, not unique to
Not unique to
Dorchester.
Dorchester.
Yes, and this is great because again, the stigma to that neighborhood, I grew up there, for 47 years, just
Yeah.
stigma, oh, don't go there because they're more violent than.
Yeah,
So thank you for this correlation. So now we can do something about it.
right.
Yes. We can do something about it. We can find it a way. Oh, other question?
Yes, I will have a question. Everybody, this is my mother visiting.
Yes. I just want to thank the panelists. I think it's such an interesting topic, and I appreciate all the input that you all shared with us today. The question I have for any one of you, I know one of us we have a panelist who's a doctor. What would you say to the providers in this country? How do they identify these issues? Is there something they can do early on rather than wait when situation gets so bad? That's number one. And what would be a general guidelines that you would give to providers? Because, you know, some of the topics that you talked about is they're isolated and it's such a bad situation. Thank you for sharing that story. And I was thinking, sitting in the back, how would you help someone like that? And there might be a lot more people out there that we do not even know till they end up in the emergency room, and then the healthcare cost. So it's a vicious cycle. We got to stop it somewhere. Thank you. Excellent.
Thanks. I would say physicians have the privilege of being trusted to some extent by much of the community. And so that privilege brings responsibilities. I think that care providers, physicians and other care providers have a responsibility to try their best to educate their patients and their communities about the risks that we're talking about tonight and about the harms that we're talking about tonight. And I think it can be challenging in our society because care providers, physicians especially, traditionally have been taught that we're not supposed to become involved in political issues. And I think that's a problem. And I think that if physicians begin to take more risks in helping to educate the community, our communities about these risks and about the fossil fuel-based infrastructure that is promoting these problems, and about the need to do something about that instantly. And that means put changes in monetary, in fiscal policy. That means changes at the federal and state level that stop funding for fossil fuel-based energy and promote an equitable development of green energy. The shorthand would be that if physicians and other health providers were able to educate the community about the importance of a Green New Deal, I think we'd start to see some progress.
Elizabeth, would you like to make any additional comments?
No, I would just echo what Jim says. I know we all understand that this is not, in fact, a political issue. This is a science and medicine issue. There is no greater threat to our patients' health than climate change. I do think that if the medical community could effectively communicate that and make it clear that this is about your health, your mother's health, your child's health, your loved one's health, period, people might cease to see it as a political issue and see it a little bit differently. I would just also say that we need to, as providers, be thoughtful about who is most vulnerable and help people prepare exactly the kind of work that Crew does in terms of helping people figure out how to keep themselves safe in the face of, you know, extreme heat or severe weather or all of that. That's as much a part of preventative health care as anything else that we do.
This is Judith Foster again. I have a question for both doctors. I have been doing some research in terms of what Japan has done in terms of using nature as a healing conduit. And so I fostered that with my own organization. Canada has just made prescriptive nature a thing. And I'll be calling and have been calling for the Massachusetts and the Boston populace to join me in calling for nature to be prescriptive for about 5 years now. So I'm just wondering, how do you guys feel about that, given that it's been used in Japan since 1982, not instead of, but as an alternative or alongside of what the normal things that we know aren't working right now?
Oh man, I think that is so exciting. I'm almost speechless. I would start prescribing tomorrow, but prescribing means I feel like at the agency I work with, it means in our clinic, I think it means we need transportation, we need an infrastructure, we need some coherent way to communicate with our patients and their families to be able to say, this day or this week, we're going to be going here, this is what we're going to be providing, right?
Yes.
We need transportation, we probably need food and water. So where's the money? That's what we need.
Yeah, I agree. I find that really exciting. I think, this is an ongoing area of research in the public health. And I think maybe going back a little bit, to provide the public health perspective, because we're not clinicians, we're not seeing patients. One of the things that is a goal, and maybe it's more of a personal goal, but I think it's also a goal for the profession, is to try and do exactly that, is to catch these things before they become people presenting to the emergency department. And that's when public health has been truly successful, is when you don't hear about these issues happening. And so what I just wanted to mention for the green space and prescriptive nature is that it presents a real environmental justice problem. In addition to the effects of climate change, there's the fact that not everybody has equal access to the nearest green space. And so, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is when we're doing these prescriptive things to try and reduce the mental health harms that are associated with environmental exposures, how do we make that just and how do we make that equitable?
I just wanted to point out, we have an online question.
Sure.
And we
Mhm.
made aware.
Yeah, I'd love to read out. There's some questions from the online audience as well. First, we had Kendra Beaver asked if you have any suggestions as measures to take when feeling particularly distressed about climate change, recognizing there's not a mental illness, but it still can impact your mental health. Do you have any things that you suggest or things that you tell folks that you know or patients you work with, recognizing that it can, still impact your mental health to have those feelings?
Do you want to take that, Elizabeth?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sure. So, there's a lot of different things people can do, and there even are some, if people are familiar with climate cafes and sort of places where people can connect to talk about some of those distressing feelings. But then there are some really simple ones that people probably already do or know about, including taking a break and allowing yourself to sort of dip in and out of taking in information and also of activism for people who are activists. I would say spending time in nature for sure is one. And again, that's a solution that we know is not necessarily equitable for everyone, given differences in access. And then another one would be finding an effective community. I personally think that that's one of the best ways to cope, is finding a group of like-minded individuals, both because that can help support activism, but also because it can help with social connectedness and with feeling less alone with feelings that can be really big and overwhelming. I don't know, Jim and Amruta, if you have anything to add.
Sorry, I just wanted to emphasize that the community aspect is really important, both from the perspective of, reducing those feelings of anxiety, but it's also a very important public health preventative tool. It's in fact one of the most powerful ones that we have during periods of extreme heat and during other types of extreme climate related events. Neighbors checking in on neighbors, friends checking in on friends, making sure that your loved ones have access to the resources that they need. That's one of the most powerful tools that we have. So it's finding a community of like-minded people who can help you to figure out mechanisms to cope. It's also relying on those folks to make sure that we don't reach the point where a mental health event has reached a crisis level.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I pulled up a report here, and I'm curious to hear people's perspectives. So quite recently, Crew and Tufts University published a report around social connections and extreme weather in Chinatown and Roxbury, and we have some folks here that are very helpful. But some of the studies, some of the findings from the studies are as such. The study pointed out that there, among the information we were able to get from people, there was a lack of awareness of extreme weather resources, and further outreach by organizations is critical to ensuring that these resources are shared. The other thing that was found is that along with formal support systems, informal support systems such as neighborhood, church communities, and workplace environments are also of importance. And I'm gonna read these other two. Social connectedness can be fostered through work such as holding community events and educational workshops, overcoming division and bringing communities together to fight for a future and safety of one another. Additionally, there are opportunities around educating community members about skills, tools, and opportunities to think broadly and systemically around climate change and social resilience. So the reason I shared some of those findings from that report is because I would love to hear from you all, and perhaps the audience would as well, is what role does hospitals play in fostering social connections in the community? And also, what role can hospitals play in distributing resources around to patients, particularly that are vulnerable, around being ready for when extreme weather hits? What are the type of resources that hospitals can distribute, and what is the role that hospitals play in helping to foster social connections within a given community?
Man, that's kind of a mind-blowing question. I'm Rita, I would like to hear your thoughts, but so briefly, I would say first, we traditionally think of hospitals as places to go when you're sick. We don't usually think of hospitals as places to go to be well. I think I think this concept that a hospital could be a place of wellness, could be a place of community, is really interesting, but I think it's complicated. For one thing, the traditional idea of a hospital being a sort of protected or privileged place where people have to take themselves when they're sick in order to be seen by experts.
You need insurance and money.
That's right. And a place where you can only get in if you have money in the form of insurance. That's problematic. And I know that in some communities, and just for example, in the world of community psychiatry, there's been a debate over whether perhaps this whole idea of a centralized hospital, even a central clinic, is maybe outmoded, and that we might be better able to help people by rethinking the idea of health services so that we were more of a mobile or maybe not street-based as much as more diffused in the community and less centralized.
Absolutely.
So I think the question about what could hospitals do, I'd rather kind of shift and talk about the question of what can health services do? What can the medical system do to provide, number one, to be more focused on healing and more focused on preventative services. This gets back to the value of public health research and public health services so that we prevent or reduce these problems before they become emergencies. But also this idea of health as a community value and less of a kind of formalized or sort of privileged, that's right, sort of commodity.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my research has been in global health context. So maybe it's informative to think about the system in India. And it's very much informed by a different era and a different perspective. But in India, especially in rural areas in India, for every 10,000 people, there's a community health center. And for every 30,000 people, there's a primary health center. And the first line of defense for health is actually members of the community who are given very basic training to go out and provide things like prenatal vitamins to pregnant women, immunizations, disease surveillance to find new cases of malaria and tuberculosis. These are not people who have an MD or in the case of India, an MBBS. These are people who are members of the community who are trained to go out and do a specific set of things. And then they know each other. They have 100 homes or 150 homes that they visit on a rotating basis once a week or once a month. And these are the people who kind of provide the first line of defense. And when we know that there's a service that's needed, these are also the people who can say, I'm not the right person for you to see, but I know who is the right person for you to see. And I can send you, like, give you the referral to the community health center, to the primary health center, to the specialist in the city. And I think that's a good system because there's a level of trust and communication that has to happen. And I think it's difficult to get that when you're going to a hospital because you feel very sick. There are some doctors who are really fantastic bedside manner, but there's a variety in that as well. And I think that the fundamental thing that we have to address in the healthcare system as it exists is exactly the point of you don't touch the healthcare system until you're sick, right? And then the other thing that I want to mention too is that there's an opportunity to provide some of these services for people who need them, who are particularly vulnerable, and do it in a way that still preserves the dignity of the patient. The really good example that I've seen in the Boston area for mental health is the Boston Emergency Services Team, which provides mental health care to people who are uninsured or to people who are on publicly available insurance, provides them with a call center where you can request an ambulatory pickup, provides access to emergency department physicians. And I think, there are opportunities to replicate that kind of work. So in the case where people are sick, whether it's because of exposure to extreme heat or whatever other issue may be triggering mental illness or episode, that they have access to the care that they need. And in a good medical facility that can help them. So those were some of the points that I wanted to make. Elizabeth?
I think I would just echo what you guys said. I think the best way that hospitals can do that is by shifting resources out into the community, to community health centers, where you can have a community garden and you can be doing education and you can be sending community health workers out into folks' homes. And that's how you build the kind of resilience and community connections that are so integral to health.
I'd like to have everyone reimagine what hospitals are, right? I would like for you to think about what I call the nurturing aspects of what we need in the communities. I'm a former medical assistant. I've worked in psychiatry and others. And so I came away in 2013 with a huge trauma. My son, Paul, had been murdered 3 months before he graduated from college. And so I can tell you from personal experiences that some kind of traumas, they dull your senses. You can't remember things, can't see to drive, and a whole host of other debilitating things that happen to you that lots of people don't admit, don't talk about. And so I found in my experience from that trauma that the hospitals could not help me, nor were they equipped to help me deal with that particular trauma. So then I had to reach into my senses, the little bit that I did have left. My mother sent me to Jamaica, where I was barefoot most of the time, country, deep country. Yes, picking fresh fruits, eating fresh everything. You guys call it organic, but it's original foods. Yes, it's nothing new. You all call it permaculture, but again, it's indigenous practices. I'm Taino from Jamaica, and it's indigenous practices. This is how I grew up. And so if we went back to those things, I think that we do each other a whole heap of justice. It'll help us calm our cognitive abilities, right, doctors? Yes. There's lots of research out there that we're not privy to that says that nature heals a whole host of our issues. And I'll digress. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Judith. There's another question that actually is very on that same topic, which I think might be up Dr. Pinsky's alley perfectly. Justine asked, she said she was frustrated with how the social and emotional learning curriculum that's introduced in schools right now isn't really addressing the relationship to environment. And says that she finds that we can often, build or deepen a relationship with the environment by gardening, learning to garden, or creating, connecting to the environment in some way. And she'd be interested in seeing urban gardening or some other form of, getting kids to teach and learn about that connection to their environment, to nature. And she asks if you know of any organizations that are addressing this maybe at the legislative level, or any work that you've heard of on that subject.
So I don't know of anyone who's trying to address that on a legislative level. Maybe somebody else in the room does.
Yes, my name is Judith Foster. I work with Jenny Bonham Carter, and I do have an organization called the Hero Nurturing Center. Again, HERO stands for Healing, Empathy, Redemption, Oasis. And we've engaged Liz Miranda, we've engaged Nick Collins, we've hosted lots of events. I've known Vernon Walker, who is head of crew now. Before that, I have worked with several folks in the Boston area. I've gone to Cuba. I hold a delegation where I named our delegation Healing Our Land, Healing Ourselves. This is my 3rd year doing that in order to get and bring attention to the fact that we need more nature and we need to have a plan for nature to heal us, especially from our mental health issues and our emotional and spiritual deficits that we're facing in this world and in our country. But thank you for that.
Yeah.
Am I on? When I was young, my mother was very sick, chronically ill. I worked in the chronically ill hospital for 7 years, just about live with them. What do we do? What do we do? I'm talking about, and then I come out with a subject like old parts. I'm not going to say old, the other thing, but what do we do about old people too? See, the chronically ill, they can't help themselves. My mother, she prayed, she was for me. But since I was 5 years old, I never saw, well, only I think Jenny knows about that. She had complications, but she still managed to fight. How can we help people to fight for their lives? That's what's I'm asking.
Helping people know that they're not alone in their distress is really important. Yeah, and pointing people to communities where they can be themselves and not be afraid, that's important. Yeah. I don't always feel that the medical community is as effective as it could be at providing that kind of support or that kind of encouragement.
What can we do?
What can individuals do? I think it's important for us to reassure ourselves or assure ourselves that we're not alone. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Big round of applause. Both here and there.
Yes.
Yes, and online. Thank you so much to our dear panelists. We're going to make a transition. We're going to cut our next segment a little short, I think, but we still want to do a bit of sharing and a bit of transition. And I'm going to distribute a song for everyone that we're going to sing together. Daniel, maybe you want to help too.
I'll help, Pastor.
Thank you.
And I'll come get the song when we're done.
I believe at home that you've been given this lyrics of this song. And before we sing it together, we'll just take a deep breath And this song has been written by Rabbi Shoshana Friedman, who was the keynote speaker at the Crew Interfaith Climate Summit in the spring. And she has told us that anybody who wants to can sing this song, and it is done in so many places, and art and music along with community is really a great resilience builder. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The task is mighty. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The land is holy. The land is holy, and so are we. The land is holy, and so are we. The land is holy, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The storm is raging, isn't that true? The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The sun is rising. The sun is rising, and so are we. The sun is rising, and so are we. The sun is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The world is ready. We are in the hope business. Everyone who is on this call and everyone who is in this room, and so many more who are not here, are also ready. And that gives me hope towards my children. It's my responsibility to be hopeful. That's my responsibility to my children. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where, continue. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This is where. That's right. We are called to be together. Together to spread hope. Together inspired to act into love. This is where we are called to be. Thank you. And let us have a little bit of a exercise time.
Sure. And maybe I'll ask real quick, just in terms of how much time because we could want to adjust it as something to just share in the chat as a quick.
We could do that, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Would you
Sure.
come to be here?
Here I come. Hi. Yeah. Hi, hello, good evening, beloved community. Just so good to be here. My name is Lee Munier, and I'm so grateful to be in this space physically and in the virtual space with you all this evening, sharing in the love and gratitude. What we did want to just offer, recognizing time. So maybe what we could do is I'm going to offer a brief statement and exercise, and we could do a truncated version of it. And then it could be something you take with you. I would encourage you all maybe after you leave us this evening to just as part of your own reflection to think about what I'll share here. So just one, it may feel in some ways that some of the information we received so much information this evening and so much knowledge from all the beautiful people who are on the panel, others who stepped up as well, Judith, et cetera. And we always want to just recognize the abundance within ourselves as well. So we wanted to just give some space to take pause and to draw from our own wells. In what ways, when there's a crisis, when there's stress, when there are heat waves, when we feel physical changes in our spaces and in our bodies, how do we show up in ways that are healthy, healing, helpful? So we heard some great strategies and some wisdom from here, and it's just an opportunity to think about what we have to offer to ourselves and to others in our community in response to the climate crises and other stresses that we're talking about. So we were going to move into pair shares and whatnot, but I think in the interest of time, and we want to allow Judith to also. You're good now. Okay. All right. Well, I think still, I just want to recognize some time that would, rather than maybe moving into pair shares, we can give some opportunity. I know obviously there is the chat function, right, through the virtual space. And then we do have a dear friend here, Anne Goodwin, who has done some other work. And I want to, maybe while people are putting ideas in the chat to share, Anne, if you wanted to, after I read this prompt and people have some time to start to think about it, come off mute and maybe share some of the work that you've been involved in as well, which talks to some of these strategies and practices. So what I just want to ask you all to do is to take, maybe we could just give ourselves 30 seconds to sort of just ground in our space, take a collective breath, and to think about some of these questions I'm going to read out loud to you all. So what's been helpful or healing for you in times of crisis or serious stress? Now, feel free to offer in the chat or maybe to others here in this room a response that could be framed in a couple of different ways. One, to describe a practice, a mantra, a relationship, a place, or something else entirely that's helped you in crises or stressful situations. If you're having difficulty to just sort of respond directly to that and to offer a direct description, sometimes it's helpful to draw upon our stories. It's the story that helps us access the heart and to access the strength in our lives and the things that we could offer. So another framing to what you might want to share is you could share a moment or a situation where you've experienced a crisis or distress, even just a few brief words, followed by a way that in that moment or situation, you were able to stay grounded, healthy, etc. in response. So maybe we'll give a couple of minutes for people to be able to share in the chat. And then again, at this moment, Anne, if you feel up for it, to maybe step off mute and to share some of the work you've been involved in.
Sure. Thank you, Lee. I don't want to, detract at all from your thought process, but I'll just say, just as offering a resource and an area of inspiration, I'm trained in a body of work called the Work That Reconnects. that's been around since the 70s. And it's a body of work that is designed to help people look at what's going on in the world and honor your pain and despair as evidence of your connection to the web of life. Right? If we weren't connected, if we weren't connected by love and deep connection, we wouldn't feel the pain. And to use that connection, that knowledge of that connection, to empower you to take action. So I actually met Lee through a book group. We were reading a book called Active Hope, which is a toolbox for resilience in all kinds of upheaval, including climate change. I'll say, Dr. Pinsky, I was especially noticed you talked about the effect on young people. I am co-leading a workshop for college age activists. It's going to be November 12th at Tufts University. So if any of you know young people who are, climate activists or any kind of social activists, I'd love to hear from you. We'd love to find them. It's called Transformation for Liberation, and it's tools for college age organizers to refill the well and find some resources and some connections to help them in community. Yeah, thank you, Lee.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne. Part of the reason I wanted to allow the space, I think, and have Anne offer that is because I know a lot of what was shared this evening is in part around the extreme weather events and the impact that has on mental health. And there was a very powerful question I think asked earlier where it was talking about in some ways sort of the emotional or the feelings aspects of climate, things that we maybe can't measure. So, and what are some ways to respond to that that are loving and increase loving for ourselves and the world. So I don't know if as we're wrapping up here, I'm not looking at the chat myself, but I don't know if Colin or anyone, if there's anything in the chat that feels important to give voice to that was shared there in this space while Anne was also speaking. So I want to just give that opportunity, maybe a minute or two in case people want to do that. And then I think we'll be closing our circle.
Sure. Thank you, Lee. The two responses that we got in the chat about practices and things that help in stressful or crisis situations are being with loved ones, turning to trees and to hiking, having that around. And also after difficult days at work, time with children. All, I think, definitely makes sense as things to turn to in the midst of a stressful or difficult situation.
Awesome. That's beautiful. Thank you, Colin, for giving voice to those. So I don't know, either Vernon, Jenny, so just naming some key people in the room here who may want to step up to share. I also want to, another thing we had talked about as well, some of the panelists who spoke earlier. I don't know if people are able to recognize how they came into the space and how they're feeling now, or if there's any people are feeling transformed in any ways, either spiritually or physically. But sometimes it is also helpful to sort of understand the benefits of these kinds of spaces and that shift from then until now, an hour and 15 minutes later. And I don't know if anyone who's on the panel might also want to just help explain the potential calm or energy people might be experiencing now and what's actually happening in the body here. Sometimes part of the reason we want to ask this too is it might be difficult, I think, to take what we've brought here to others and help them understand the benefits of it. So it's helpful to sometimes have some phrases or framing for explaining the importance of this work to others. Yeah. So I don't know, either Jim or Elizabeth, if either of you want to speak
I
to
guess
that.
I would say, we have all, whether virtually or in person, we've joined together and built some of that community and connectedness that everyone has talked about all night. and that certainly there are strategies and techniques and things we might experience that can help us in the moment feel better. But I believe that it is probably partly also just the process of coming together and finding commonality that helps.
I don't know, Jim, if there's any, feel free to, if you want to. Here comes Jim.
I don't have anything to add. Things like that. Thanks. Thanks, Lee, for asking.
How do you want to, are you going to cover? Okay. So I think just, in the spirit of what this evening means, I think Jenny we're going to close out for the evening. And we were hoping to do so again through song. If people are wondering and why music is a part of this evening, music is itself a practice that helps us when we have crises and stress. So you could think of it that we are also putting into practice in this moment, some of the things that we could take away from this space. So hit it, Jenny. And anything.
Thank you.
Let's have a quick, how about the Interfaith song, I'm Gonna Let It Shine. This little light of mine. I used to think this is a childish song, but it's not a childish song at all. It can be sung at all times. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. In the midst of worry, in the midst of worry, I'm gonna let it shine. In the midst of polarization, I'm gonna let it shine. In the midst of COVID, in the midst of COVID, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And at home, as we're singing here, Lee and Judith are walking around holding stones and other things from nature. This was something that we were perhaps gonna have time to do in our grounding exercise. And this is something that anybody can do at any time. Take a look at the leaves and the trees and feel awe and feel that it is possible. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, 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 all the time. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you,
Yes.
panelists and everyone,
This was a
Lee and
great,
crew
great,
for
yes,
organizing
thank
it
you guys for
all.
putting this together. It's awesome.
Thank you, everyone in the
you.
online
Thank y'all.
community.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to everyone in person for including the online audience.
And we will have the recording. We should have a recording of this in the next week and a half or so.
Sorry, just to repeat what Vernon mentioned as well, for anyone who's signing off, there will also be recordings for this that will be available online. We'll get them out to you. Much love all. Be well.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
You preparing for me.
Yeah, thanks everyone for setting up and interesting the audience. Really appreciate it, making it happen.
Thank you, Harry.
I wish I could be there in person.
Can I leave?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
Appreciate the help.
Yep.
This is great.